Eleanor Roosevelt had this great quote. She said that poor minds talk about other people, average minds talk about events, but great minds, they talk about ideas. Yeah, of course I believe in LGBT rights. Of course I believe in women's rights. Of course I believe in minority rights. You know why? Because they're all individual rights. We all have rights as individuals. General Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated American soldiers in all of history, wrote an entire book called War is a Racket. The value of the dollar has gone down by over 96% in the last 100 years. The Second Amendment is not there so that we can go outside and hunt rabbits. It's there to keep us free. And actually, I would argue that if anyone needs the Second Amendment, it's minorities. Historically, unarmed minorities fare the worst in all of history. Those are the genocides we all hear about. Look, violence is wrong, all right? Whether it's cops or whether it's riots, it's unacceptable in a civilized society. You know what really gets me is everyone knows that the largest polluter on Earth is the U.S. government. All right, so how are they the ones going to solve the problem? You know what's insane is we have the largest prison population in the entire world, and over half of them are for non-violent crimes. Welcome to the Take On Everything podcast.
What's up, guys? Welcome to the show. As always, your host, James Cook, here on the Take On Everything as we take on everything. Today, I want to talk about something that I've been doing a lot of research on lately, and I found quite fascinating because I had never heard of this before. I heard about it a few years ago. Before that, I'd never heard of this. So I want to lead into this story, which I'm not going to tell you what it is just yet. But I want to talk a little bit about how gun control, a little bit about the history of gun control in the U.S. as it regards minorities. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a quick, just kind of overview to kind of set a series of events. I feel like this isn't talked about a lot. I feel like a lot of people, it's really traditional, especially in the 21st century, is like, oh, Republicans like guns and Democrats don't like guns. And there's also stereotypes on the right that, minorities tend to have illegal weapons. And then there's the stereotype on the left where we need to have more gun control to keep people from killing each other. And then these crazy Republicans are always trying to put guns in people's hands. And it's kind of messy. And I feel like it's just an argument it's just kind of like a power argument over wanting to control somebody else. And kind of just impose their kind of belief onto other people. And I think the people that it hurts, I don't think a lot of people realize how much it actually hurts minorities and people that would potentially benefit the most from being able to defend themselves. So I kind of want to go through just a little bit of the history of gun control in the United States, why personally I think gun control has a history based in racism, and how I think that translates into what we see today, and just kind of a couple other tie-ins. So hopefully this makes you think a little bit, and I'll use an illustration of a really interesting story, as I alluded to earlier, to kind of make a few of these points. So, gun control in the U.S., obviously, before the Civil War, there was a significant, you can imagine, like you may not know specifically, but you can imagine that, black people, slaves probably couldn't have guns, or if they could, it was under real strict circumstances. The first actual piece of legislation that specifically was passed in the colonies against African Americans, the blacks as they were called in the time, or I think I can say Negroes, whether slave or free. It didn't matter if they were a slave or if they were free black men in the colonies, because there wasn't necessarily that distinction until later. The first law passed was in 1640 in Virginia, one of the first colonies, and it was a total gun ban based on race. So no African Americans, whether slave or free, could carry any guns. So first thing, 1640, that's really, really, really early on. They're like, nope, no guns for black people specifically. Then in 1712, the Act for Preventing Negro Insurrections was also passed, banning guns again. I guess they didn't ban enough guns in 1640. They expanded it. That's what it was. So it included mulattoes, which, if you don't know, mulattoes are when the African population that was brought over as slaves mixed with either the indigenous or the white populations, and then you have your lighter skinned, maybe mixed with some Native Americans or Hispanic cultures in the Caribbean and Central America. And they became what's known as mulattoes. That term is actually still used today in South America. It's fairly derogatory. But in 1640, and also then later in 1712, Virginia expanded their complete arms ban, their gun ban, to mulattoes, Negroes, and Indians, quote unquote. Generally, I don't use that terminology, but so here we are, 1712, again, really early on. 1640 and then 1712. Then also in 1712, South Carolina, another one of the really early colonies, made the same type of total gun ban based on race called the Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of the Negroes and Slaves. So again, not all Negroes were slaves, but all Negroes and slaves could not own guns, according to Virginia and South Carolina. Then, 1791, after the American Revolution and the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, 1791. So the revolution was in 1776. We really didn't get. We had the Articles of Confederation there early on, and then we get to 1791 when after the Constitution was ratified, they then amended the Constitution with the Bill of Rights. So the Constitution passed, then the amendments happened in 1791. That's when you get the Second Amendment. But 1792, blacks were excluded from the militia, and therefore were not allowed to own guns. In the Uniform Militia Act of 1792 called for the enrollment of every free, able-bodied white male citizen between the ages of 18 and 45. So again, less than a year after the Second Amendment says all men, they say no, just the white men can have guns. So immediately, within a year of the Bill of Rights passing, nope, not African Americans. They cannot have guns. So it's a continual threat. So now it's 50 years into the colonization of the United States, and several years into the actual founding of the United States, and we've already got racist gun control. Louisiana, 1806, complete self-defense ban for slaves. So these were the beginnings of what is known as the Black Codes. So you have a completely separate law for blacks versus whites. So blacks could not defend themselves with firearms against whites or slaves, which were considered property. So they could defend themselves against other free blacks, but not against slaves because they were whites' property, and then not against whites because, yeah. So that was in 1806 in Louisiana. Interestingly enough, the background for that was the slave revolutions, and I believe it was Haiti and the DR at the time. It was Haiti. At the time, they had revolted and had overthrown the plantation owners, and so Louisiana, who was actually a little bit closer, and they were kind of a little bit more in tune, especially because of the port. They were in tune with Haiti. They traded with Haiti and the DR. They heard about this, and they're like, "Oh no, we can't have this." So again, this is another excuse to take weapons away from both free blacks and from slaves, and just making it illegal to defend themselves. 1811, building on that 5 years later, Louisiana, again, complete ban for slaves. So before it wasn't even good enough. It wasn't that they couldn't defend themselves. Slaves were not allowed the sale or delivery of firearms at all, and that is 1811 in Louisiana. Again, now we're about South Carolina, who was one of the early adopters along with Virginia. Technically, this was a liberalization of gun laws. It required the master's permission for a slave in order for that slave to possess a gun. So the slave could have a gun if the master gave them express or written permission to have a firearm, and as long as they weren't around other white people, they were not allowed to carry this gun. 1825, Florida trying to catch up with Virginia, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Florida decided to pass the so-called Act to Govern Pistols, said that designated that white citizen patrols shall enter into all Negro houses and suspected places and search for arms and other offensive or improper weapons and lawfully seize and take away such arms, weapons, and ammunition. So Florida's like, oh crap, all these other guys are banning African Americans from having guns. Again, all stemming from some of the very, very popular slave rebellions and slave uprisings in the Americas. It made the colonies in the early United States very nervous. Florida, again, 1828, and then 1828 actually was a liberalization of Florida's gun laws. They said that free blacks were permitted to carry guns if the court gave them written express license. They started selling licenses, essentially. And interestingly enough, the licensing was fairly expensive in order to try to prevent free blacks. But there were some very, very successful free blacks in Florida. And so in 1831, after some of them started to buy firearms, again, complete race-based gun ban, repealing that 1828 law allowing some free blacks to carry guns. 1831, Delaware is trying to get on board with this. So they are a little bit more liberal. Again, a lot of these are just terrible because they're completely race-based. Free blacks are permitted to carry guns if written express approval from a court and they obtain a license from the justice of the peace. Again, high taxes, what is known as in the economics world as prohibitory taxes. So basically you try to price something out. You don't make it illegal because, technically we sound bad, but we're going to tax the hell out of it in order to prevent you from using it. New York has tried to do this in modern times with cigarettes. So now if you go to New York and you want to buy a pack of cigarettes, it's going to cost you like $20. It's called a prohibitory tax. And usually the excuses are fairly nefarious. In the case of gun control, repeatedly throughout all of American history, the excessive prohibitory taxes come into play a little bit later once you pass the 14th Amendment. And technically, you can't write laws based on race, similar to the black codes that you're seeing in the colonial times and the early constitutional times in United States history. Maryland, 1831, complete total gun ban, race-based, regardless of free or slave African Americans. Only white. So again, these complete race-based bans are not just blacks. You're talking about blacks, mulattoes, Mexicans. I'm using the terminology of the legislation. Blacks, mulattoes, Mexicans, Indians, again, Native Americans. Any of them cannot have guns. White people can have guns. Nobody else can have guns. Florida comes back, and because that 3-year time period between 1828 and 1831, some blacks had gone ahead and purchased guns and had guns. In 1833, they sent people to go confiscate guns again. They went and searched. Authorized white citizen patrols, again, similar to the 1828 law, to seize all firearms found in the homes of slaves and free blacks, and provided that blacks without proper explanation for the presence of the firearms will be summarily punishment without the benefit of judicial tribunal. Well, dude, you do not get trial by jury. You do not get the benefit of a trial by your peers. Do you know why? Because you're black and you are trying to defend yourself. Not even aggressively, just have something in your home. So even in the United States, the land of the free, the home of the brave, where you're supposed to be able to own your property, you're supposed to be able to be, your home is your castle, where you're supposed to be able to defend yourself. Simply owning a piece of property that was not approved by the government landed you in jail, no trial, no jury. And that is terrifying. That is a terrifying precedent. And it's something we should all keep in mind, that it gets tried out on minorities first because just by sheer volume, they can't make as much noise. And so they kind of get overridden. So we're only in the 1830s, okay? This is well after the Bill of Rights. This is well after a lot of the great thinkers, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and James Madison, all of these founders that talked about individual liberty and all men created equal. And you start having these things pop up. It's kind of insane, just the contrast where you can believe a principle, but then it doesn't apply to everybody. So I think it's really important to kind of just take a look at, do you actually believe something if you apply it selectively? All right, so 1833 is a bad year. Florida, they just go through somebody's home and they take their stuff and they arrest them if they don't have a good reason or if they don't have a license, okay? Again, because they said, oh, you can have them if you have a license. Well, in 1833, if you don't have a license, even after the ban, like if you had an old license or whatever. Insane. 1833, complete total race-based gun ban. It shall not be lawful for any free person of color in this state to own, use, or carry arms of any description whatsoever. That's not just guns. That is anything that could be deemed an improper weapon. 1840, Florida, because they just can't, every couple of years, they just have to redo it. Complete ban for slaves. They can't even deliver. So the slaves cannot even make, sell, or deliver firearms in 1840. Like you can't even look at them. You can't even get the idea to look at defending yourself. Texas, 1840, same year, complete gun ban for slaves. 1844, North Carolina, race-based gun ban upheld because free blacks are not citizens in a court case. The state versus Newsom. Blacks are not citizens, so they don't have the right to defend themselves. Again, the high aspirations and the beautiful language that somebody like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison used, that all men are created equal and that each man has certain inalienable rights, which means rights that come from your existence, come from your humanity, come from your God, if you believe in that kind of thing, that cannot be taken by any government. They just took it, just like that. So it's insane to see because it's so close to time frame. Like these ideas are fresh in people's minds, and I think Thomas Jefferson and James Madison lived into the 1830s, if I remember correctly, and so this was right around their time, and they had written plenty of treatises and pamphlets and things talking about the equality of man. And actually, Jefferson, I know he gets some bad rap for a lot of things, and there's a lot of things to say about some of the founders. Jefferson actually ended up writing several treatises on how horrible the slave trade was, and how he actually personally believed that that blacks were equal and should not be treated the way that everyone else was treating. And he kind of lamented that there was no additional support besides himself. And so that's why he spent a lot of time in France, because in France it was a lot more liberal. So I think I would blame Thomas Jefferson in some of this to where he essentially didn't have the cojones to stand up more than he did. But I feel that it's difficult to judge too much from a modern case, because if I say, hey, I'm against slavery, or hey, I'm against racism in 2020, it's not as bold and terrifying a statement as if it were in the height and the heyday of slavery, when all of these laws were everywhere and it seemed to be the common consensus, and you have abolitionists actually being killed. So I would absolutely say that Thomas Jefferson, while he's a philosophical ally, he just did not have the guts to follow through with it. So that would be a criticism. So you can think all day. You can think all day something is correct, but if you don't do anything about it at the end of the day and you know what's right and what's wrong, I think that's a fair criticism. Absolutely. So while I love a lot of his writings, it doesn't translate always into action, which is an unfortunate part of philosophy and politics. So here we are, mid 1840s. So we're getting close to the big shebang. Florida again, 1847. It's just a routine thing. Every decade or so, they just run through and they start confiscating guns and just ransacking the houses of free blacks. And just to make sure that they don't have any contraband stuff. Could you imagine living in a society like that? Like, just imagine, like, I'm a white person, obviously, right? I'm pretty pale. But if I was systematically, like, I just knew every couple of years I was going to have armed thugs running through my house and just to see what I had and make sure I didn't have anything dangerous. I couldn't even fathom. I could not imagine the type of tyranny that existed in somebody's mind. And the reaction to that, I don't blame a lot of the slave rebellions and the revolutions. I actually encourage it. I would hope I would be one of them. Because living under that kind of tyranny is absolutely horrible. You're just trying to take care of your family and work and make something of your life, and you're constantly harassed. Harassed and killed, Harassment is the least of your worries at that point. So, 1847, 1848, Georgia does the same exact thing. 1852, Mississippi, a little late in the game. Complete race-based gun ban in 1852. No firearm ownership by free blacks or slaves. 1857, the High Court of the United States in Dred Scott versus Stanford, slaves again are ruled. So before they were ruled in state court in North Carolina, now it is a federal thing. They are not citizens. So here we are, 1857. They're not citizens. They don't get guns. Georgia, again, a couple years later, complete gun ban again. No sale or delivery. So apparently, you're not allowed to have them, right? And then people were figuring out either a way to get around it or some kind of share use or some kind of thing like that. And they're like, no, you can't sell, deliver, you can't even look at these things, okay? They're so terrified. Every couple of years, they just amend the law and they just keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse. 1861, the Civil War begins. Same year, 1861, Florida does that whole confiscation search thing. They're like, well, we're just going to go make sure that that the free blacks and the slaves don't arm themselves and try to take advantage of the situation and free themselves and stand up and defend themselves. This is tough, actually, going through. There are so many laws over and over and over again, and the entire pattern here is just consistent harassment. It's tough to watch, and it's... So anyways, I'm going to skip forward just a little bit because it is the same thing over and over and over again. So we're going to go to 1866, immediately after the Civil War, which is interesting, right? You think, oh, Civil War is over, here come the good times. Not quite. So slavery is abolished, 1865, now 1866, Alabama's like, all right, fine, we lost, but a total race-based gun ban. North Carolina, 1866, total gun ban. So the federal government got wind of this. They're like, okay, I see a pattern. Here's the established pattern. Then you have the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which got rid of the black code. So the black codes, again, like we talked about, were the separate code of laws that were, you have your white codes and you have your black codes. They're parallel but completely different. And so it kind of enabled this whole abuse of, you're free, but you're not actually free. So 1866, they banned that. And then also in 1866, because that didn't actually legally get rid of a lot of the gun laws against minorities, the 14th Amendment essentially says everything has to be provided equally without regards to race. So rights are rights. The Bill of Rights applies to everyone, etc., and so forth. Then in 1866, in response to the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, the Ku Klux Klan forms. And it just kind of takes this whole late 1800s thing and runs with it. So, so now the state governments have to get creative. And mind you, this is, interestingly enough, this is government oppressing people systemically over and over and over again. Whereas I would imagine that a lot of the poor whites and the free slaves, the free blacks, and then the slaves, they probably they were in the same kind of plight. And it was like the master class, and it was, the people in charge in government, the people in charge of the guns, didn't want to allow any kind of insurrection ideas or the ability to defend themselves of the lower class of people. So they have to get creative. So Tennessee starts, because they have to apply all laws equally now, because you can't have the black codes and the white codes and all that stuff. 1870, so since they're starting to get creative, passes the Saturday Night Special handgun ban, which was, it banned the sale of a lot of different types of handguns, the cheaper, less expensive handguns, with the argument, everyone knows this argument, the Saturday Night Special, it's kind of it's almost a joke. It's a pretty well understood colloquial understanding that you buy a cheap gun to go kill somebody because you're mad right there, right? So the argument was, that's how it was passed. We're going to prevent a lot of these quick, angry murders. You run down to the corner store, you grab a gun, you shoot the guy. That wasn't happening. What was happening is that the free blacks and the poor whites were purchasing inexpensive handguns, inexpensive weapons, and defending themselves. And guess what? That kind of pissed a lot of people off. So, remember how we talked about the prohibitory taxes? This was an early example of what would become prohibitory taxes, is they would just ban all the cheap guns, and then you could only buy the really expensive guns. And this was where gun control of minorities started to get really creative. The whites, which already owned guns from the war and could afford to buy them, either already had the guns or had the resources to get them. The blacks could not. They couldn't afford to purchase these highly expensive guns. And so this started kind of a trend in the U.S. Arkansas, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, all through even into early 1900s. Let's see, total civilian handgun, so this was South Carolina, total civilian handgun ban, except for sheriff's deputies. And so towns would deputize the entire white population, because that was one of the requirements to be a deputy. And then they would just deputize, 500 people. Towns were pretty small then, but you just deputize everyone, and then not deputize the blacks, and then they could not own firearms. Let's see, Mississippi, 1906, they started to have mass registration of firearms, required the manufacturers to keep records of who had them and the ammunition and the sales for those guns and those ammunition. And then they would send officers to go inspect the firearms. Technically, you can have them, but we're going to inspect them and see what you have and what you don't have. So it was just a lot of this harassment stuff. So now we're in the early 1900s. We've seen this kind of pattern, this history of very specific and sometimes really creative gun control, whether it be prohibitory taxes, trying to price things out of the reach of underprivileged minorities and communities, or just the outright complete ban of them in order to keep African Americans from uniting and defending themselves. And that's what brings us to the early 1920s. So on May 31st, which is my birthday, that's kind of why I really dove into this. It's just like, how crazy is this? This was on my birthday and I had no idea. The Tulsa race riots of 1921, as they're called, or the Tulsa Massacre, depending on who you ask and who you talk to. Let's give a little bit of background. So Tulsa is in Oklahoma. Oklahoma was up until the early 1900s was a territory, and as a territory, it was divided up between Native Americans and the Oklahoma Territory in the U.S. And what they did was they allowed a lot of they opened up the Indian Territory, and they allowed what became known as a land rush or a land grab. And a lot of the free blacks in the U.S. decided to go stake a claim. That's how you did it. They said, hey, we're, open up, you can come just stake a claim and, homestead essentially, which just means putting the land to use. And you can go start your new life, look for better opportunities. So a lot of the blacks congregated in Oklahoma because it was, hey, pretty much free land, which was great. And Tulsa became a hotspot. It became a really big economic bed. But you have to remember that segregation was still a thing. So even though the black codes were gone, you still have Jim Crow laws. You still have segregation. You still have the separate but equal. So the blacks got one section of the town, North Tulsa, and the area became known as Black Wall Street, and it was kind of a play on the success of Wall Street in New York, how it was very, very economically prosperous. But Black Wall Street was because everything was so segregated. They had the one section of Tulsa, North Tulsa, and it was kind of like a captured market. So what happened was all of the blacks lived in one area. They weren't allowed to shop, eat, sell, do anything in the white section of town, but they could shop and hang out and have a good time in their section of town. So they became a very kind of self-sufficient community. They weren't as wealthy as if they were able to, kind of trade and, have commerce with the white people, and it wasn't so segregated. But because it was segregated, you essentially have, in economic terms, you have something called a captured market. So a captured market is a market that doesn't really have a lot of options, but they kind of do what they can with what they have. So if you wanted to go see a play, you had to go to a play in North Tulsa, in Black Wall Street. If you wanted to go out to eat, you had to do the same thing. You couldn't just go to the white section of town. You could work in the white section of town if you had a pass from your white boss, but you couldn't stay there. You couldn't eat there. You couldn't use the bathroom there. You had to go back home there. So a lot of them chose to work and live and eat and enjoy their area in North Tulsa. So just a little bit of background story. In 1915, the film Birth of a Nation was released, which for a while the KKK was kind of like, we kind of give up. We don't have a lot of energy anymore. 1915 was the Birth of a Nation kind of really reinvigorated a lot of the pro-white / white nationalist / anti-minority sentiments that were kind of just there. And then once it became very popular, it started to get a lot more momentum with some of the people that were a little bit more easily influenced. The people that are like, they don't really have a lot of beliefs, but they're like, oh, that looks fun. That looks like a lot of energy. I'm going to hop in on that. So you have the unfortunate effect of drawing some of those people that are just looking for something to do. And then you get caught up in this whole movement, and then you become a horrible, horrible human being. Surprise! You're the reason why we look at history and be like, ugh. So that was 1915. So then and then we, immediately after that we have World War I. A lot of the African Americans served in World War I. They came back, and there were still some issues. So then they started to voluntarily, it was legal that they had to segregate, but they sort of voluntarily segregated. They were making their way. They were making their own living, which was really impressive, and that's why Black Wall Street was so interesting. Is they were segregated, they were separate, but they were equal, if not more. They were very economically prosperous, They were easily all, lower to upper middle class. And there was, interestingly enough, there was a little bit of envy going on between some of the lower class whites that lived and worked in white Tulsa, and seeing just the economic prosperity within Black Wall Street. So this was all going on in the background. And then in 1919, because we didn't have enough war and destruction and death from World War One, we had this summer of 1919, there were, 24 major riots in the U.S., and they were all local, whether it be police or militia or basically local whites that would invade the segregated portions of town that were for the black community that were starting to prosper and do really well, especially during the turn of the century with the industrialization. So they had a lot of stuff. They were materially more successful. They started businesses. Separate but Equal was actually sort of working for the African Americans at that time. And so this caused a lot of envy, a lot of upset. So there was a lot of riots, a lot of invasions, a lot of, killing, unfortunately, going up to this point. And it was known as the Red Summer because there was so much blood, is how it's put. So here we are, May 31st, 1921. There is high tensions going on for years. You have the rise of nationalism and distrust of minorities, a little bit of envy because of all the minorities are starting to succeed even without the white people. And they're figuring they're out their way, and they're making it work, and it's like, you start to get jealous, right? Especially if you don't have a lot going for yourself. There's a lot of divisiveness. And they were an easy target. Kind of, if you think about what happened in Germany with Hitler, Germany had a lot of problems. They had a lot of economic problems. And then you just have this really easy scapegoat, which is minorities and Jews, and it was they just get blamed for everything. So again, here we are, 1921. And there's an incident. You know how you always have, like in these horrible, horrible events in history, you have the spark that ignited the flame that caused everything to go to hell. So the trigger was, we don't know exactly what happened specifically, but we do know that there was a shoe shine or a shoe black, or basically somebody that cleaned and shined shoes. He was a young black boy. He was 19 years old. His name was Dick Rowland. He lived in Black Wall Street, obviously, because he had to, but he worked in white Tulsa, and he would shine shoes for a lot of the oil guys, because during this time, oil was the main source of income for a lot of people in Oklahoma. It was one of the biggest oil producers in the country at the time. So Dick Rowland, he's got his daily routine. He goes out there, he shines shoes, he makes some money. And, if you got a nice tip, you could do fairly well. It's kind of like, how waiting tables, you can make a lot of money if you do your job well and you're nice to people and do all this. So he had a good reputation. He was on the corner. He shined shoes. He had a thing. The only problem was he was not allowed to go to the bathroom anywhere near he worked. There was one place he was allowed to go to the bathroom. And it was a local business center, and it was a multi-story building, and he was allowed to use the bathroom all the way at the top. And so at the time, you have elevators, right? Nowadays we don't have elevator attendants, but there was an elevator attendant in this building, okay? And so he gets into the elevator. This young woman was the elevator operatress. I don't know how that works. Sarah Page, she worked every day, so she probably knew Dick. She probably had given him rides up to the top of this building several times. They were probably fairly familiar with each other. And something happened. Nobody knows exactly what happens. She screams. He screams. He runs out of the elevator. She's on the ground, kind of like screaming. And everything goes to hell, right? So he's gone. This white girl's screaming. This black kid just ran off. Everyone's like, oh, rape, right? So that night, the Tulsa, I think it was the Tulsa Tribune, I think that's what it was called. Local paper basically published a story that said that Dick Rowland raped this girl in the elevator in broad daylight and then ran off. So, of course, cops, they show up at Dick's house the next day, arrest him, take him to jail, awaiting trial, which is a good thing. All right, not saying that he should have been arrested, but we don't actually know what happened in the elevator. I have no idea. That's what a trial by your peers is for. So he was arrested. Then, because the Tulsa Tribune decided to publish a whole bunch more inflammatory pieces, there was editorial. And of course, these don't exist anymore. They were actually physically cut out of the paper when the paper was, for all you kids out there, they used to take these hard copy papers and they used to put them onto microfilm. And so you'd have like something that looks like a computer screen, like an old school, like curved TV screen, right? And you put your microfilm in there and there's really, really small pictures, like negatives in an old film camera. And you'd like kind of scroll through them. And so it'd be like a really big picture on the screen of this really, really tiny picture, but the pictures would be the newspapers, right? So when they were microfilmed, they were literally cut out. So if you look at those pages and those articles from that day, there's literally a cutout missing of where those articles were. But from all kinds of accounts, both of the black community and the white community, they were extremely inflammatory and were along the lines of, we should go lynch this N-word. Then there was another one encouraging violence against the black community. And so it was just extremely inflammatory. And so in the defense of some of the people that were reading this paper and didn't really know anything about anything, if you have this published, it's like, what are you supposed to think? Like, it's drumming up this racial hatred and saying, hey, this guy went and raped this, woman in your community. What are you going to do about it? That kind of thing. Obviously, that's wrong. But if you're getting all your information from this inflammatory paper, bad things are going to happen. So it turns out it started out at about 1,000 people gathered at the jail. They wanted to go lynch this gentleman. The sheriff said no, so they sort of called for backup. They turned out to be 2,000 white people armed with guns, and a lot of them were World War I vets, so they had a lot of military weaponry. So they were all outside, and they were threatening to storm the jail. The sheriff actually apparently did a great job, and he tried to keep everybody back, said nobody's getting in here, we're doing trial by jury, etc., and so forth. He actually barricaded up the door. But by this time, some people, bypassers, got back to Black Wall Street, after work, whatever, and they said, hey, these people are trying to storm the jail and lynch Dick Rowland. And, because of the recent riots and the recent killings that were going on, that red summer that we're talking about, these African Americans, they're like, no, not here. No, we're not going to put up with this. We're sick and tired of this. And so even though it was difficult for blacks to get guns, they still had them. It was still a territory, so it wasn't as difficult as some of the other states. It was a state at the time, but just from accumulation of when it was a territory, just about everyone had guns. But even so, there weren't as many black gun owners as there were white gun owners. So you had like 2,000 whites out there with their guns, and you had 75 African Americans from Black Wall Street go up to the jail and kind of stand in front of the jail and said, you're not getting in here, right? Then the sheriff is like, look, this is just going to inflame people. We got it under control. Go back home, right? They go back home. There's another report maybe a few hours later from another passerby. It's like, hey, guys, this is getting really out of hand. We should probably go down there and defend this Dick Rowland guy. And so they come back again. Again, the same 75 guys. They're armed. Some of them are World War I vets. So they're just like, look, guys, no lynchings. We're not going to put up with this. This is insane, And, coming from people that are, middle class, they're like, okay, we're kind of like standing people in this society, and this, we kind of have the right. You start to feel a little bit more confident once you're doing well. So they get up there, and then there's just a lot of taunting. There's a lot of name calling. There's some expletives that are exchanged, and these are firsthand accounts of people that are interviewed after the fact. And some of the African Americans, again, the sheriff comes out. It's like, guys, this is really going to get out of hand if you guys still stay here and stand here with the guns. Maybe you should just go home. And they're like, okay. They start to wind down. So they go to get back in their cars, and apparently, according to the story, one of the white guys, as the black guys walk past them, says, "Hey boy, what are you going to do with that gun?" And then the African American guy says, "I'm going to use it if I have to." And that really pissed everybody off. The white guy tried to grab the gun. Somebody shot something. I'm assuming, nobody really knows, but I would personally assume if somebody's grabbing my gun, it's probably the gun that's like pointed at the ground that got shot. Then everybody starts opening fire. Not fully, but people start shooting, and then somebody shoots the African American gentleman that had the weapon and made the smart remark to the white guy who was taunting him, and they shoot him. And then the mob surrounds this guy. Somebody calls the ambulance and the police, and they show up. And the ambulance, the EMTs try to get to him, and the mob will not let them through, so they just stand there. The African-American guys in the cars are getting really upset, and then they're starting to get nervous, so then they go back to their Black Wall Street area. And at this time, the mob is really incited. They're literally letting this guy bleed out in the street, not allowing medical attention, and so they're already amped up. They're ready to go. So they end up following. They start going to Black Wall Street, and they're armed and they're angry. They got almost literally torches and pitchforks. They're going there with their cars. They're shooting out of the windows. And interestingly enough, for a few hours, the blacks in Black Wall Street were able to defend against this incoming mob. You have like 2,000 people are invading your area and shooting, right? And they were able to defend for several hours. The entire riot lasted about 18 hours. They were able to defend and repel these small bands of rioters because they were armed, right? That actually gave them time to get the women and children out. So some of the firsthand accounts of people outside of Tulsa, several miles out, are seeing women and children, black women and children, leaving in the thousands, like rolling by their small towns and houses, trying to get to another safe area. And it's because the men in Tulsa, the African American men that were armed, were defending their houses, sitting there. They were shooting at these armed white rioters that were coming in there trying to light things on fire and kill people. And of course, they were killing people left and right if they could. But they were able to hold them off. And so it took several hours, but the whites went back and they got reinforcements. According to some stories, early in the mornings, this happened overnight. And as the women and children left, and the black men were able to kind of defend the area somewhat, fairly successfully. What happened in the early morning, apparently airplanes, there were 6 airplanes, according to several accounts, that the white people in the surrounding areas got into, and they started dropping kerosene on the houses and lighting them on fire that way, because they couldn't get in because the African Americans were so successful at repelling their forces. And then the white mob grew. So they grew from anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 to about 5,000. And Black Wall Street had a population of about 10,000. So most of the women and children got out. And the black men were, the ones that didn't, unfortunately, were massacred and murdered. There's lots of unfortunate stories of women and children being shot point blank. And these are, firsthand accounts of people, the children that were there, that talked about it, and just seeing all the bodies everywhere. If you get a chance, I don't want to go too much into detail with all these individual accounts. It kind of just brings tears to your eyes, but the point was that a lot of the African-American women and children were able to leave Black Wall Street as everything was burning, and as their husbands and young men were defending them from this crazy mob. They were able to buy enough time to get most of the women and children out. Eventually, these 5,000 rioters were able to overcome and kill everyone that was left. Um, Turned out to be about 300 people were massacred, according to newer estimates. At the time, it was only 36 that they led on. Um, but seems that recent Red Cross estimates put it at about 300 African Americans were killed, and about 50 whites were killed in repelling those rioters in those early hours of the riot. Which kind of, could you imagine how horrible that would have been, having 2,000 armed men against 10,000 unarmed women and children? How much of a blessing is it that these African American men were able to defend themselves and get the women and children out and at least save, I would imagine, several thousand. This story could have gone so much. It's a horrible story. It's hard talking about it, but it could have been 10,000 instead of 300. And I commend the bravery of those men in the face of danger, not running, defending their property, defending their families, defending their lives. It's just long enough to get their women and kids out of there, for the most part. Still some, unfortunately, were killed, but oh my God, I couldn't have imagined being in that position, knowing that you're probably going to die, but getting your family the hell out of there and willing to sacrifice your life for them as the most unimaginable thing happens. Your life is being destroyed in front of your eyes. The bravery is just, it strikes me, it gives me chills. So in the morning of the following day, the National Guard is called out. The white rioters disperse and they go back into their homes. No white rioters were ever arrested or charged. One was charged, but the charges were dropped because they were not able to point to him specifically and say that he was part of the rioters. However, all of the remaining blacks that tried to come back the next day after they were some of the white business owners actually hid a lot of the blacks, especially their employees, in there, and they took a big risk doing that. So I commend them as well, by literally standing up to the mob and hiding and protecting these victims of this attempted massacre and this actual massacre. So there were some good actors, but just the insanity was mind-numbing. So the next day, the National Guard takes over, declares martial law. None of the whites were arrested. However, every remaining former, resident of Black Wall Street was arrested and put into internment camps for inciting a riot. Which just, it's like you get invaded, right? And you probably have lost some of your family or at least friends that you know, and your house is burned, it's rubble, there's nothing left, it's all firebombed, it is completely destroyed. Everything you worked for your entire life is gone. And you get arrested and put in an internment camp until they can figure out whether you participated in the riot or not. Just the ridiculousness, the absolute ridiculousness of that is just insanity. So, I'm going to try to wrap this up fairly quickly. But they started to, once the economy started to slow down for the whites, because none of the menial labor jobs that the African Americans were doing for them, like store clerks and shoe shines and seamstresses and cobblers and making shoes, anything like that was done by the African Americans was not getting done anymore. So the Tulsa economy started to go to hell. And so a lot of the white business owners started complaining, and then the National Guard was like, okay, if a white person signs for a specific black person, right, says they're going to take care of them, they're in charge of them, they're vouching for them is what it was called, the voucher system. You get a signed voucher from a white person. They could be a business owner or just somebody that would vouch for you. Then, hey, why don't you put this tag on your arm to show that you've been signed for, and then you can go to work. But you have to come back here. It's like a halfway house. I don't know if that reminds you of anything, but it certainly reminds me of some things. And this goes on for months. And there were 600 businesses in Black Wall Street. There were hundreds I think it was 2,000 homes. So 1,400 insurance claims were filed for those who had insurance. 0 were approved because of the riot clause. Most insurance companies had a clause that if it were due to riots, that they would not be able to be compensated monetarily. So once the blacks in the internment camps started trickling back into the streets with their little tags on their arms showing that the white people had signed for them and vouched for them, they essentially created a tent city. Eventually they rebuilt. Eventually it got back to its former glory before eminent domain. We'll get to that later. But it took them decades, and they got no help. And they had to start from scratch. Could you imagine building all of this with your bare hands and then having someone destroy it and then have someone tell you it's your fault? There was a commission almost a decade later that was supposed to investigate it independently, and their findings were that the African American community brought it on themselves, therefore would not be eligible for any kind of city assistance. Just one thing after another. So there's these huge tent cities. People are struggling. The first thing they do is build a church, because that's a strong sense of community, especially even today in the black community. So that helped bring a lot of people together. And they took them several decades to rebuild. But the ones that could not, that had mortgages on their businesses or properties prior to that, which was the majority of them, they defaulted because they couldn't make any more money. So the town repossessed them and sold them to large corporations in the area. And so even though part of Black Wall Street was rebuilt, it was not really of the people, by the people, for the people. It was a sort of land grab by the local town, and they sold it to... Sometimes they sold it to other wealthy African American business owners that either had survived the riots and the massacre, or white business owners that kind of allowed black managers in Black Wall Street, just seeing the economic progress they had previous to that. They thought it was a good investment. But either way, it was a land/wealth transfer to others from people who had been victimized many times over. And if that weren't enough insult to injury, after they rebuilt the church, which was a rebuilding of another church, which was 90 days old when it was burned down, if that weren't enough, eminent domain was used to put a highway right through Greenwood, which is the local town name. You know, every city has like a local district was Greenwood. And they put a highway right through there. And used eminent domain to confiscate all the land they wanted. And to me, it's just a series of just, holy crap, did that really just happen? And then before the words are out of your mouth, did that really just happen? It's like all of this series of insane things where I would have done lost it by then. I couldn't imagine. And then just to go back to work. Just to go back to work. In my mind, it just boggles my mind. I have an immense amount of respect for the survivors of that. I have an immense amount of respect for the people who died that day, protecting others and defending their homes, businesses, families, friends. And I think it's a really good reminder, because this is a story that's not... I never really learned about it in school. And until recently, I wasn't even aware of it. And I think there's been a positive resurgence of uncovering of stories like this, just to help remind and kind of give just a good reminder that some of this stuff is not as far in the past as you may hope, and that I hope. A lot of it is just like, oh, that's ancient history. It's not. You're talking about a generation or two, and those memories don't fade that quickly. And two, it's a really interesting case study. If you kind of remove the emotion from it, it's a really interesting case study of how minority groups are treated by majority groups, and this is going to be kind of like tying into how we opened the episode, and how the great equalizer, which is the ability to defend yourself, turned a a historic massacre. I don't even know if that's the right. 300 people is a massacre. You know what I mean? But turned a massacre of upwards of 10,000 to a massacre of 300. And as horrible as that distinction, I hate having to make that distinction, but the ability of the black inhabitants of Black Wall Street to defend themselves and save their families and buy them some time was literally the difference between thousands of people's lives. And I think that is something we need to remember when we're talking about policies and gun control and talking about dealing with minorities. It's difficult. I've been in conversations with a lot of progressives or liberals that very, very in favor of gun control. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, it's really easy for you to say that because you really don't have to face that off chance or that possibility that you are going to be targeted, threatened, overwhelmed, and potentially massacred just for being who you are. You don't have to face that. That is the farthest thing from your mind. So you're already starting from a position of a position of strength, a position of not fear. Whereas imagine that same situation if you are a part of a minority group that historically 60, 70 years ago, your parents went through some of this stuff. Imagine being in that position and then somebody telling you, no, I actually think you would be safer if you were not allowed to defend yourself, and we just trust the powers that be to protect you. Because the powers that be are the one thing that consistently, that's the entire first 15 to 20 minutes of this episode was consistently the powers that be exploited and took advantage of minority groups. And there are countless numbers of examples in history, but that's just American history. And then getting into the civil rights riots in the 50s and 60s, which is not that far in the past. To getting into those, trusting the powers that be is a bad plan for, is an overused example, but the Jews in Nazi Germany, the Ukrainians in Soviet Russia, the blacks in America. The list goes on and on, but the factor that makes a horrible situation slightly less horrible is the ability of individuals, especially minority groups, to defend themselves and to take actions into their own hands and not be victims. That is the one difference. And in closing, I'm just going to read a little bit of a history. So going back to the Black Panthers, which, as you can imagine, don't sound too crazy up until this point into history. We've gone through all of this gun control and violence against minorities, and then you have the Black Panthers, and a lot of white people would be like, oh, no, they're just radicals. They're crazy. They want to, segregate themselves and defend themselves and use weapons, and this is scary. But what do you think? What do you think is a logical outcome from all of that history? And now they're here, now they're feeling empowered, and now you have a problem with it. And it's kind of funny. You have, again, the progressives and liberals are the ones that are for gun control at this point, especially in minority communities. And don't tell me that's not the case, because if you look at stop and frisk, over 90% of the people that had gun violations through stop and frisk were minorities. So if you're telling me they weren't targeted, then you need to re-examine your facts. So, the Black Panthers, they are a logical outcome of this history of you're not allowed to defend yourself. Just trust the powers that be, as the powers that be are abusing you. So 1967, Oakland, California, you have the birth of the Black Panthers, and they like to do these demonstrations just to say, hey, we're not going to be trampled on anymore. We're not going to be messed with. Their motto was defend yourself. What was it? I'm gonna read this to you. Let's see. Is it by any means necessary? Right. That scared a lot of people. Malcolm X was talking about trying to assert yourself and not be abused. And I think that's beautiful, and it's a logical. He was a radical, but in a good way. He was a radical combating all of these other radical things that had happened to minorities in the past. So I want to read you a little bit of a story that I think is kind of beautiful and really emphasizes the difference between a population that will be abused and a population that, even if you are a racist, you're going to think twice. February 1967, Oakland police officers stopped a car carrying Newton Seal and several other Black Panthers. They were carrying rifles and handguns. One officer asked to see one of the guns, and Newton refused. He said, "I don't have to give you anything but my identification, my name and address." He learned that in law school. The officer said, "Who the hell do you think you are?" And this is the ballsy part. I don't know if I'd have the balls to do this, but Newton said, "Who the hell do you think you are?" He said, "Yeah, I have the legal right to carry a firearm." And the policeman, who took a second, a little bit stunned, he probably isn't even used to being talked to that way ever. He said, "Well, what are you going to do with that gun?" And Newton said, what are you going to do with your gun?" So by this time, with the yelling and the elevated voices and the Black Panthers, who drew attention wherever they went, drew a crowd of bystanders. And he said, "If you try to shoot me or you try to take this gun, I'm going to shoot back at you." And, I swear, if anybody, probably including a white person, but specifically a Black American in this situation, if he did not have a firearm in his hands and he was telling the officer a very his legal opinion, right? The law says this, back off. If you try to shoot me, you're going to see what happens. I swear, if that is the case, you are getting shot or you're getting beat. Except what happened here? You have a car full of armed Black Panthers telling the cop to shove it because he wanted to take their guns. They have a constitutional right to carry. They have a constitutional right to own guns. They were not doing anything illegal. He gave him his ID, and the officer was still persistent that he needed to give him his gun. And so after saying, "If you try to shoot at me or take this gun, I'm going to shoot you back," the officer backed off. There's a crowd at this time, and guess what? The minority was not oppressed. Nobody was shot. Nobody was killed. No laws were broken. But somebody, a historically oppressed minority, asserted themselves with a firearm, the great equalizer, and the arm of the state, the officer, who historically, as we read through all of those laws and all of those events, historically, that would not have gone down too well, except this gentleman, Newton, had himself a firearm and was not afraid to say, "If you try to violate my rights and take my property and impede my freedom of travel, I will defend myself as necessary." And I think that is the lesson of these stories. I think that is a lesson that everyone should take from this, not just minorities, anybody, anywhere. If you're a minority in any situation, I believe that the smallest minority is the individual, which means that you're in charge, you own your life, you own your body, you own the right to your life, and you own the right to defend yourself. So I apply this across the board. The minority is the individual is the smallest minority. I believe that if anyone needs weapons and needs the ability to defend themselves according to the moral and historical record, it is minorities or groups of minorities, including African Americans, Hispanics, anything, anybody, anywhere. If you're a minority, you need to be able to defend yourself, because this story right here is exactly what happens. And I can't tell you how the number of armed protests just this year in 2020 of both whites and blacks. Okay, you have a lot of there's a large armed group of 1,000 plus African Americans that openly carry in Georgia, Stone Mountain, Georgia, on a regular basis just to assert their rights. Then you had armed groups approach the Capitol building in Michigan during the lockdowns to demand an ending of the lockdowns, and those are white people. Guess what? Nobody got shot in either one of those scenarios. Everyone was perfectly safe. Everyone was perfectly fine. The police didn't shoot anybody, even though they were heavily involved. They were there. But they kind of just said, hey, look, if we escalate this, this is going to get bad. And that is the story here. You can't just trust everything else to be fine all of the time. That, if there is any white privilege, that's what it is. Just telling minorities to just trust us. Trust us. We'll take care of everything, just like we've always taken care of everything. Just ask the Native Americans. Just ask the Haitians. Ask the African Americans. We will take care of you. You don't need to defend yourself. And if anything is white privilege, that is. The fact that you cannot see that minorities should be able to defend themselves against bad people with state power or gun power, there is something wrong with you, and you need to reevaluate how you look, what your perspective is on life and on your role in it, and stop trying to tell everyone else how to live and behave because from your cushy lifestyle. I think you're missing a lot of history and a lot of the points of self-ownership and the right to defend yourself. All right, guys, that's all I have today. I've gone on my rant. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope we learned a little bit of something. I hope we were able to start a conversation, open some minds, explore some topics, and I had a blast. I hope you did too. If you guys want to support the show, there is a great learning database called Liberty Classroom. Liberty Classroom is a site that teaches college-level courses all from the perspective of liberty and freedom. So we talk about economics, we talk about history, we talk about philosophy. We do all of this from the perspective of a liberty, free people, free individuals, how freedom works, and all wonderfully qualified individuals. You have doctorates of economics, history, philosophy, and they all do a wonderful job teaching. If you want to support the show and gain that wonderful education in a classroom type setting, you can download them for podcasts, you can watch the videos, you can do PowerPoint lectures, and it is a great value. I've done it for several years, and boy, let me tell you that the amount of things that I've learned have just, I never could have done it without Liberty Classroom. I drive a lot every day, and I just have it on in the background. I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to listen to this lecture one more time. They're on, hour lectures, and there's, set up like a class, so it's like 16 or 17 different lectures. Comes with PowerPoints, potential quizzes, like all this stuff, and you can interact with the professors. It is top notch. If you want to learn more about liberty and have a better argument as far as how freedom works and examples historically and economics, and you want to learn all of this stuff just to be a better individual and a better freedom lover, go to libertyclassroom.com. If you want to support the show, there'll be a link in the show notes. Click on that link. That's my specific link, and I get a little bit of a kickback. So if you are going to sign up for Liberty Classroom, go ahead and do that. Check them out. But when you go to sign up, use my link so you can support the show and keep me rolling here, guys. It has been a great, fun episode. I've had a blast. I hope you had a blast too and learned a little something. Look forward to interacting with you. And until next time, stay free.